My pleasure and my privilege to welcome all of you here today. You might be able to hear from the sound of my voice that I've begun this new year with one of those wonderful bugs that's on the go. So I'll be leaving most of the facilitation to other members of our team today, mostly to Lorraine, in fact. But I'm so glad to be able to welcome you. You know, we're so pleased we are joined today from people from across the country who wear the many hats of accompanying adults in faith. So, who are we here from across the country? We know we have diocesan directors, we have parish and diocesan catechists, we have teachers, faith animators, and superintendents from several Catholic school boards across the country. We have spiritual directors and small Christian community leaders. We have professors from a variety of universities. We have chaplains, priests, and deacons, and members of religious communities. And we have a number of people who represent various movements, associations, and networks of catechists from across the country. So, if anyone is accompanying adult faith in a capacity I've not yet mentioned, please write that in the chat for us so that we have a good, full, comprehensive view of who we are gathering here today. I also believe we have participants from every province in the country. I never consider that a small feat, and it's just wonderful to be together from coast to coast. A very warm welcome to all. Now, as we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Sister Mary Ellen Francoeur. She's our wonderful liaison with the Sisters of Service, who were trailblazers in religious education in Canada, and whose legacy we are very honored to continue in the work we're doing in adult faith development. Mary Ellen has been with us from the very beginning as a treasured partner in our work. And I know that other members also of the Sisters of Service are here participating today. And also Jean Gove, who's the chair of the Daily Foundation. And the Daily Foundation oversees our funding. So we would not be here without their generous funding and support. We're very grateful. So you're also very welcome here today. And when you have the chance to delve into the book a little further, if you haven't done so yet, you'll see that Mary Ellen has written a beautiful foreword and that we've dedicated the book to the Sisters of Service. And so St. Paul University, you may know, is on unceded territory, and we would like to respectfully acknowledge that as we begin. You may also know that the Center for Religious Education and Catechesis is housed in the School of Leadership, Ecology, and Equity at St. Paul University. And so I'd like to invite my colleague in the school, Professor Bianca Brasciu, to read our land acknowledgement. Bianca, please.
Thank you. Kina, hello everyone. Pijashig, welcome. We would like to acknowledge that St. Paul University is located on the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabeg people. We would like to honor the Anishinaabeg, the first peoples of the lands and waters of the Kichisibi from time immemorial. We acknowledge that the site of the city of Ottawa serves as the home of the Anishinaabe as a place for spiritual ceremonies, cultural gatherings, and exchanges among First Peoples. Today, the spirit of peace and friendship is the foundation of relationships among Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples from around the globe.
Thank you, Bianca.
Thank you.
Now, Dr. Ann Walsh, who many of you know, is another treasured partner in our work. And among Ann's many talents, many of you will know this, is excellence in leading prayer. And so Ann has kindly agreed to share that talent with us today and has prepared an opening prayer for us. Over to you, Ann.
Thank you, Carol. I'll just share a screen and let's do this. Let's come back. There we go. And so we begin with a word from the prophet Isaiah. Do not remember the former things, or consider the things of old. I am about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. You have woven an intimate tapestry and called it light and called it good. Our God.
All creation calls you blessed, and so do we.
In love, you have formed a universe, diverse yet related. To you, each of us, as each blade of grass and each star, is an irreplaceable treasure, a companion on this journey of love.
Our God, all creation calls you blessed, and so do we.
What we choose changes us. Who we love transforms us. How we create remakes us. Where we live reshapes us.
So in all our choosing, O God, make us wise. In all our loving, O Christ, make us bold. In all our creating, O Spirit, give us courage. In all our living, O Three in One, may we become whole. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Anne. As usual, you've given us a wonderful beginning. Now, right from the start, we want to invite you to join in this book launch webinar, not as a spectator or a member of an audience, but as a member of a community of practice. We want to be able to engage in a meaningful, interactive session together where we can listen, learn, and discuss the important things that are on our minds these days when it comes to creating effective learning and growing spaces for adults in faith. The book we're launching with you today, we're so glad you've joined us for that, is concerned with exactly that, where faith and life meet, adult faith education that transforms. Before we go a step further, we need to acknowledge the wonderful partnership with Novalis that made this book possible, and especially the brilliant work of their managing editor, Anne Louise Mahoney, who helped bring the pages to life. The need for research and resources in this field is pressing, and we are pleased that it is also a Canadian resource. The book is the product of 5 years of awareness-based action research in search of insight into the gap between faith and life and the practice that bridges that gap to support the development of mature Christian disciples. It is about faith education that is both for the life of the person and for the life of the world. I'd like to introduce you now to my co-editors of this book, Doctors Lorraine St. Marie and Miriam Martin. Miriam and Lorraine have both been involved as co-researchers with me throughout this project from its beginning, and also as friends and colleagues in this work over the years, over many years. And it was a joy and a privilege to be able to work on this book together. You will soon see that the book contains 12 chapters, some written by us and others by a collection of contributing authors. And these contributing authors are all leaders in the field from across the country. All of them have participated in our research as either focus group members, semi-structured interviewees, or both. Over these few hours, little bit of time we have, we'll introduce the book to you and unpack it with a little bit of help from some esteemed commentators who you'll meet in just a moment, and some panelists, as well as with the help of our contributing authors. So in this process, we're hoping we can all engage in some good conversation about some of the things that are on our minds about effectively accompanying adults in faith. And here's our plan to hopefully facilitate that for our community of practice gathered here today. We've had our welcome and introduction, land acknowledgement, and opening prayer. This is an overview of the virtual book launch. In just a moment, our esteemed commentators will be introduced to you and will provide us with some good insight as food for thought. We'll then have an overview of the book with the help of our contributing authors. We'll move from that to a meaningful panel discussion with the help of Dr. Cynthia Camera and Father Raymond LaFontaine, who you will meet at the appointed time. And following that, we'd like to give us all an opportunity to move into some hopefully rich, meaningful discussions in breakout rooms together. We'll give you some guidance for that as we move into it. Following that, we'll come back for some interactive plenary with participants, with all of us, and our commentators and panelists. And following that, we'll have a brief conclusion and a closing prayer. Does that plan sit okay with everyone? All right, I see some heads nodding, so I'll take that as a mandate to move forward. Thank you. So again, I invite all of us to engage as interactive participants, not members of an audience. And to help that along, I invite us to listen with a particular ear on for three things, if you would. Please listen for, first, points of resonance. Where are you hearing points of resonance with your thinking, your experience of leading in this area at this time and place? Second, listen for new perspectives. Those are the things that open up our learning and growing edges. And don't we know how much we need to do that consistently? So new perspectives, things we don't already know, rich source of learning for us. And finally, consider the impact, the implications for your practice. What changes because of any of this in terms of what we will do when we leave here in our leadership? So points of resonance, new perspectives, and the implications for practice. And of course, as always, we pay attention to questions, insights that might arise as we move through the time together. And all of this, we hope to be able to gather up in a meaningful way for that conversation at the end of this time of input. And so with that, I'll turn things over to Miriam, who will move us to the next part of our time together.
Thank you, Carol. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce our two commentators. And the first is Dr. Jane Reagan. Jane is not a stranger to us at St. Paul University, having collaborated previously with us from some time ago and with the center. She is Professor Emerita, as Carol has said, from Boston College, and has a wonderful reputation in the field of religious education. She's made her mark on religious education in many ways, but her focus on adult church and faith formation with learning theory has been recognized as path-breaking and innovative. Her challenge to the church and to religious educators has been to attend to God's call for a mature faith, for nurturing an adult faith within our church and communities. The work that we are offering here with you has great resonance with Jane's vision. And Jane, once again, we offer you a very heartfelt welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate this, and I'm happy to be here. It's good to be here to mark the publication of this book that brings us into creative dialogue, both theoretically and practical, in the research that it was done and in the way in which it was set up. And on top of that, it's always good to gather with people who share a common interest to reflect together on how we think about and engage with adults in faith. Like many of you, I've been interested in this work for a very long time, about 40 years or so for me, teaching, writing, and engaging in the work of accompanying adults as they strive to bring faith into their lives and life into their faith. Now, when I pick up a contemporary book in adult faith formation, the first thing I do is to skim the table of contents and the endnotes for themes that I think are essential to the topic that ought to be in there. There are 4 themes that I look for. Spoiler alert, they're all in this book. That is, the first one is developmental theory. Developmental theory gives a sense of what we're moving towards, how we understand adult or adult faith. And here in this text, it was examined in the context of people like Fowler and Keegan, construction developmentalist theorists. Their work is enhanced by the work of Otto Scharmer, whose work I was unfamiliar with, though I found him fascinating and look forward to reading more. And Scharmer very much points us to the second theme of that I look for, and that is transformative or transformational learning. That focuses on the way in which an individual experiences significant structural shift in the way they perceive and understand the world around them. From this perspective, learning isn't simply adding more information, but changing the way in which one hears and takes in or structures that information. So transformational learning. Now, key to transformational learning is my third thing that I look for, and that is a discussion of conversation. A little aside. There's a little known fact among college professors that we really only have 3 big things that we say. We express it in all different ways, depending on the focus of the topic of the course or what we're writing. And one of those 3 things that I say in every course that I teach, and each book, is this: adults learn best in conversation with other adults about things that matter. Adults learn best in conversation with other adults about things that matter. Now, while I think that applies to a lot of different topics, it is particularly true when we speak of maturing in faith. So conversation is the central role in bringing about adult faith, and it's serving as a context in which adult faith can come to expression. And the final topic that brings us all together is synodality. In many ways, synodality is at the heart of the work of the text, and is in fact at the heart of the work of conversation. Synodality presumes mature adult faith. It presumes the ability to deal with ambiguity, to engage in the process of discernment, and to participate in the experience of transformative learning. To speak of synodality is to ask, what kind of church both supports and expects adult faith? Synodality. Okay, so the 4 themes that I find run through and really structure this book are developmental theories, transformative learning, conversation, and synodality. And those are key elements in the way in which we accompany adults and the direction that that accompaniment is moving. Now, there are many other themes in the book that deserve attention, and these key ones are central and are integrated into the fiber of this collection. Now, before I finish, I want to mention 2 cautions. They're not specifically cautions about this book, but general concerns that I have about the field of adult formation or adult accompaniment. The first one is this. 5 or 6 years ago, if I was looking at a new book on fostering adult faith, I would expect to see a good deal of conversation on the concept of evangelization. Evangelii Nuntiandi, a document from the 1970s, says, the church exists in order to evangelize. Now, evangelization is in the book, but as a secondary theme. I'm concerned that, not in this book, but in the life of the church, it can appear that synodality has replaced evangelization as a raison d'etre for being church. Now, I believe that evangelization synodality can and should be seen in relationship. We have a tendency to think sequentially. So for those who have been in the work of adult faith formation or adult faith work for a number of years, say 20 or 30 years, might see that the discussion of evangelization replaced Christian initiation of adults as the focus of adult work. And now synodality seems to be replacing evangelization, which was last year's now big organizer. Synodality then can come across as kind of the latest fad, which it too will pass then. I don't have time now to talk about how I understand the relationship between evangelization and synodality. We need to be cautious not to see them as dropping evangelization for a shiny new concept. It's much more significant than that. And the second comment, or the second caution I have is related. How do we keep from reducing synodality to simply an organizational technique that is primarily about a new way of making decisions rather than a new way of being church and an ongoing expression of the work of evangelization? Now, I'm out of time, but I have one last comment. On the front cover, this book is described as a Canadian resource for all who accompany adult faith. Now, while it's clearly shaped by Canadian culture and perspective, this collection would be helpful in the United States as well. I honestly don't think there is another book in the US that brings these multiple themes and multiple approaches into conversation with one another so effectively. And for that, I'm grateful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. I have to say that was very encouraging as well as challenging. Just what we'd expect from you. I'd now like to introduce Father Ron Rollheiser, who is also not a stranger to St. Paul University. As an oblate, he has visited us on occasions at St. Paul's. But he has, of course, been in other places for many years. And recently, he's just completed his term as president at our sister university, the Oblate School of Theology in San Antonio, Texas. And there he remains on the teaching staff. But many of us know Father Ron through his books and his columns. And as I say, although he spent years elsewhere, we are very proud to continue to claim him as a Canadian. And as I now myself find myself in Ireland, I have to say that I was quite delighted when one of our sisters passed me the Irish Times, Irish Catholic Times, and she was quite taken with an article. And when I had a look at it, it was by Father Ron. And I said, you know he's a Canadian, eh? So let's hear from Father Ron.
Okay, thank you. And it's not easy speaking after Jane. I'm not sure I can match this, but where faith and life meet. This book, I want to begin with the story. I taught for years at Newman Theological College in Edmonton, Canada. And one day we were giving a workshop to high school principals, superintendents of Catholic schools. And I was with a Franciscan colleague, and we were just presenting some very basic teachings from Vatican II and so on. And at one point, and most of them surprised these people who were in leadership. At one point, a man said, you know, granted, I didn't know all this stuff. He said, did your dad know this stuff? I said, no, but he was a farmer in Saskatchewan. He wasn't in charge of teachers and religious education for a lot of people. I use that as a background because in many ways, at its root, this is what this book is addressing. When I look at it and the essays in there, I see at root it's addressing two major issues we have in our church, but in all the churches. And the first one is simply the lack of adequate faith formation for adults, for the vast majority of adults. I'll double back on that. And secondly, the the lack of awareness both inside of the laity and the clergy and the hierarchy about what we are all initiated to in our baptism. That in our baptism, we are all ordained. I'm an ordained priest, but I've been 3 times ordained. Most of you have been ordained twice, but most Christians don't realize they've been ordained as a priest to be a minister, to pray, minister, and administrate inside the church. Now, a little bit of each of these now come back on synodality. First of all, the lack of adequate faith formation for the vast majority of Christian adults. I don't want to single out Roman Catholics here. I work with evangelicals, Protestants. We are all weak, okay? And it's simply this, crassly put, for a lot of Christians, Roman Catholics, our faith formation stops with confirmation. They were initiated into First Communion and so on, and then it's kind of dropped for most people. And then what happens in our adult life, that our lives grow infinitely more complex. There's never been a time on earth when it's been more complex for a human being to live, to walk this planet, okay? And yet we are often trying to live that with an adult, with a childlike or an adolescent perspective on faith. So see, we need, I think more than anything else, to work on adult faith formation, because we have complicated adults living complicated lives, and their faith formation isn't adequate to integrate that. And secondly, more subtly, but just as importantly, is that there's a lack of awareness inside the laity and oftentimes inside of the clergy and hierarchy of what our baptism initiates us into, which is basically an ordination. In our baptism, we are ordained as surely as a priest is ordained in his ordination, that we're responsible as adults for the church, to pray for the church, Eucharist, the office of the church, to help in the sacraments and to administer it and help in administration. Now, most of us are still caught in a false notion that there are 2 tiers of discipleship. There's laity and there's clergy. There aren't. Theologically itself, there aren't 2 tiers of discipleship. Laity are called to a certain thing, clergy are called to a certain thing. They aren't. And in fact, one of the great emphases of Vatican II was precisely after centuries of that, to try to break this down, that and not just Vatican II, that's in our theology of our baptism. In baptism, we all are ordained as priests, and we're responsible for the preaching, the administrating, and the building of community. And in fact, if I dare say this, today, most of the priestly work is not being done by clergy. And I can pick on clergy because I am one. Remember Morris West, the famous Australian Catholic novelist, he was once asked, he said, "Do you believe in women's ordination, that women could be ordained priests?" And he said, "Absolutely." He said, "Almost all the most effective priests in my life have been women." He said, beginning with my mother, who taught me the faith. He said, today, he said, my wife, who's my real confessor, see that with sacraments, with everything, building of community, we, laity and priests and hierarchy, they're equally responsible for this. And it doesn't mean there aren't separate roles sometimes, but there's not a separate theology. And we're all part of the same team, the same evangelization of Christian. And now, that is the bottom line of this book. That you look at every one of these essays, in some ways intended to emphasize the importance of adult faith formation, and then with the theme of synodality, to really emphasize that we're adults, not just in decision making, but in everything, in administrating, and we need to make the church work, and that's a job for all of us, and we'll do it a lot better And we'll do it a lot more effectively if we can do it together. And synodality is to make that happen together. So I highly recommend this book. My dad was a Saskatchewan farmer. He didn't read the book. His life wasn't as complicated. He didn't need to read this book. But today, every adult Christian needs this. We need to my mind, one of the biggest single things is lack of adult formation. Adult with complicated lives, getting more complicated every day, trying to integrate faith without enough roots. And also that old idea that's still there, that there's two tiers in the church. There are laity and there are clergy. There aren't. So I recommend this book.
Thank you very much, Ron, for that interesting and also challenging perspective. And now it's my pleasure to turn over to my colleague, Lorraine.
Hello, and it's my turn to say welcome. I'm just so pleased to see you all here and to be here with you today. So it's my pleasure now to walk you through this book. And for this, we will call upon each of the authors, the contributing authors, to say a few words about their particular chapter. And to help with the flow of this overview, I'm going to put up a slide that gives the title and the chapter, the title of the chapter and the name of the contributing author for each of the chapters. And so I'm going to ask authors, when you see your title, I will ask you then to speak. And Gabrielle's going to spotlight you so that we can see both you and the slide together. And so we begin. Here we are. And so following the foreword and the introduction that is written by the editors, we move into chapter 1. And so I am going to put this, and we call then upon Carol.
So my chapter proposes that just like those disciples whose encounter with Jesus on the road to Emmaus turned them around and changed everything, we need to allow our perspectives and practices in adult faith education to be transformed. We all want to be able to help design and lead learning and growing spaces for adults in faith that meet people where they are and fulfill the two purposes of adult faith education. First, for the life of the person, and second, for the life of the world. I hope that my chapter will help us to recognize and address some of the serious blind spots in our theory and practice that are holding us back.
And for chapter 2, it's my understanding that we are going to listen to a short video from Archbishop Panadri Durache, who's the author of chapter 2.
My chapter, entitled Lighting the Path in a Synodal/Missionary Church, helps us better understand the current context of our faith as the era of Christendom slowly fades away. It identifies points of convergence and synergy between the practice of synodality and a renewed approach to adult faith education. My chapter.
Hi, Lorraine. It played. I think you might have just not heard it.
It's been played?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. I didn't hear it. That's why I asked. Thank you. I guess it's because I've got my slide on. So that's great. Thank you for that. All right, chapter 3, which is my chapter. So in this chapter, we make the connection between mature Christian discipleship and human maturity. And for this, we explore 2 resources that hold together the importance of spirituality, science, and social action. That is action that serves the good of the world. Otto Scharmer's Theory U helps us understand the many tensions and disruptions that we are experiencing in our lives and in our world today. Robert Kegan's Constructive Developmental Framework offers us key elements of the adult developmental journey in which we increase our ability to engage with complexity and uncertainty as we seek deeper communion with self, God, and other. And so it is our hope that you will discover the richness of these 2 resources for growing our capacity to transcend our prevailing tendencies towards polarization and to engage in spirit-filled transformative action in which human flourishing and mature discipleship are inseparable. Miriam.
So in my chapter, what I was attempting to do was to open up the whole idea of accompaniment in those threshold liminal spaces that are full of possibility as well as challenge and difficulty. All of us know traversing those threshold spaces of change bring us into places where we hold and we need to be held. Accompanying adults in those moments can really help to move and anchor people in their adult faith development, using the work of Fowler, James Fowler, to try and understand a little bit more what's going on in those spaces, along with Jack Mesereau and his reflections on the disorienting dilemma. I hope that it teases both the lead learner and those you accompany into taking more time and more attention to those moments, which can be sometimes very uncomfortable and yet very rewarding.
Anne.
Thanks very much. It is my firm conviction that the role, or one of the roles, of adult faith formation is to help people, assist people, walk with people, adults, toward putting our story in touch with and in dialogue with the story of Jesus Christ, of the mission of Jesus Christ, of the power of the word. And so knowing that a role for faith formation is to put our story in touch with the story, then we ask the question, why? And the question is for deeper and for fullness of life, that adults seek to grow and seek to grow at those moments when they feel called beyond what currently is. The parameters that have constrained them no longer do so. And so story has a power to transform and to call us forward. And so in the chapter, I hope to flesh that out and really capitalize on and encourage people to think deeply about our own stories, how God is present and calling us forward in and through our stories as individuals and also as communities. And why? For fullness of life, for greater understanding, for deeper engagement.
Carolina.
My chapter explores the essential role of dialogue in ministry. This focus on dialogue was inspired by my personal experience in ministry over the past decade, placed in conversation with the voices of Otto Scharmer, Pope Francis, and Paulo Freire, as well as the research from the CREC. In the chapter, I seek to unpack the process of dialogue that we as lay and ordained ministers in the church recognize as essential to accompaniment, and I provide or hope to provide a tangible framework for implementing this process in our different ministry settings. One key idea that I emphasize is the identity of ministry leaders as lead learners rather than lead knowers. I identify this shift in perspective, the shift from having all the answers to seeking the answers together as the fulcrum of dialogical accompaniment. I use this experience of this model of lead learner not only to show how it fosters agency and the environment needed for adults to accompany Jesus, to encounter Jesus in a renewed way, but how this model is also transformative for ministry leaders and their relationship with Christ, a spiritual renewal that is vital for all of us to remain authentic witnesses on the faith journeys of the adults we accompany.
Christine.
So my chapter, The Mutual Relationship of Adult Faith Formation and Synodality, looks at how there's kind of a circle between in synodality, which synodality functions the best the more mature we become. And synodality also helps us to become more mature. The other point that I make in my chapter is that synodality has great promise for helping us to deal with some of the really awful polarizations in our church right now, because there's something about really attempting to listen to the other that breaks down some of the barriers when we're only being ideological. So true listening can really be a very powerful way where we can grow in our faith beyond a lot of barriers that we've put up. I use the documents of the Synod, and I also use Otto Scharmer. And the final thing that I do is I propose ways in which, Jane, you talked about how synodality it would be a mistake if it was just thought of as another sort of way of making decisions and left at that. And so in my chapter, I propose what this would look like in a parish, in the community meal program that you run, in the catechetical programs that you run, and I sort of take many of the elements in liturgy, and look at how a synodal and adult faith model will affect the entire parish life and practice.
Charlene.
So the need for good process that helps people connect faith and life is well known to those of us engaged in adult faith accompaniment. I was a focus group member of the first phase of the research, in which we designed a template for a process spiral that can help us meet that need in our practice. I hope that my chapter will provide readers with a practical, concrete tool they can use, craft sessions that encourage encounter and transformation.
Corinne and Christine.
Okay, so I'm just hoping our chapter will just encourage and support the creation of communities of practice all across Canada and beyond. My hope is for each of you and those who are watching this to engage in building and participating in a community of practice, because I can really say that being part of a community of practice is transformative, and it really leads to real change in adult faith methods. So my hope most of all is that our chapter will equip you, not just with theory, but with practical, real ways to witness change and also be agents of change in adult faith approaches. And honestly, my greatest hope is to continue to connect with many of you over adult faith, sharing our stories and experience. So let's continue to explore and nurture ways of adult faith that empower, equip, and transform for God's glory.
My hope is anyone who reads this chapter will hear in it the gifts that being part of a community practice has been for Corinne and I, as we have grown in our ability to listen and accompany the adults we journey with. I hope that adult faith practitioners will see that forming a community practice is not another program they need to add to a busy schedule. Instead, it is a synodal method of listening to our ministry practices and drawing wisdom from our experiences. As Pope Francis has invited, I hope that as we reflect on our adult faith experiences, there will be a conversion of our ministry practices to meet the real needs of the adults we accompany. As we heard from the prophet Isaiah at the beginning of this time together, creating something new for today's cultural context.
Murray.
Thank you. In my chapter, I was looking at questions around how we can more effectively welcome and support and fully include 2S LGBTQ folks in our churches, especially in the world of Catholic education, which is where I work. But where those conversations have often proven particularly challenging, controversial, and hard, especially over the last decades. So how can we in Catholic education and in Christian life more generally today allow the life and the faith experience of 2S LGBTQ plus individuals and their communities to help us imagine, to help us offer spaces where we can struggle together lovingly, respectfully, in places where it's not always simple, not always obvious or straightforward how our life experience and the life of the institutional church connect with each other. So it's very much about a dialogue between those two realities. And I really believe that the papacy of Pope Francis, including his penitential pilgrimage to Canada a couple of years ago, and the experience of the recent synod, offer us some really rich lenses for what that might look like and how we might do that on a grassroots level.
Now, the next two chapters are actually written by Carol and myself. However, they are based on the wisdom and insights that have been shared by people that we interviewed. And so here we're going to call upon Father Daryl Corbier-Winkler, who's going to say a few words about his chapter.
Thank you. First of all, I can't tell you what a growth experience it was for me to participate in this whole project with Carol and Miriam and Lorraine. It was a real process of evangelization itself, talking about it. Anyway, what I got most out of it, because my mother was Indigenous, and I claim to be Indigenous. My father was American, but a lot of my formation, the way I think, comes from my mother. You know, who doesn't have that in their lives? And she was fully Indigenous woman coming from a community in Manitoulin Island. And so a lot of her thinking is I've learned how to think like her. So I think like an Indigenous person. And in all of this discussions that we had, I was in phase 2 and phase 3 of this project. Listening was such an important component. And I thought that's what it is for Native people too. For Indigenous people, that's how we learn. If we think of listening as a form of evangelization, I have never been more evangelized than listening to elders and to other Native people talk about their experiences of faith and growth and how they've survived, resilience, all of these things, reconciliation. So I see that listening is a very important component of adult faith education because we can be evangelized too. I don't want to repeat what other people have said, but everything they say resonates to what I think too. You know, Marilena talked about dialogue, but that includes listening. Christina Way Skinner talked about it. All of these talks have something to do with dialogue, listening, speaking, like Murray just was mentioning. And so the challenge for Indigenous people in Canada anyway, and I don't see how it would be different in the US, is that we're trying to overcome several centuries of colonization. And colonization simply, for me, is being told by Eurocentric ideas that we're inferior, that our spiritual practices were inferior and pagan, satanic, that our cultures were were inferior, that everything we did, the way we thought, how we managed our lives was inferior. And this, after generations of this kind of colonization, you begin to believe it. You begin to believe you are inferior. I know that was the case with my own mother. So decolonization is the path forward, not just for Indigenous people, but for the whole church, to relieve ourselves of the notion that someone is inferior to others, or others are superior to others, is a real source of problems and problematic functions, even the way we do adult faith formation. So this lead learner discussion that we heard, that's the path forward, that we don't see ourselves as only the givers of the gospel, but also that we're transformed by the work that we do. Finally, I just want to say that Pope Francis has taught us too that there are new forms of colonization taking place in our world, in the digital world, in the technological world, and in the world of thinking. We've mentioned polarization happening in the church between kind of a progressive way of thinking and a kind of reversal, I don't know what to say, conservative way of thinking. And in where I'm at here in Ottawa, there are parishes where young women now are wearing the veils again. The mantillas that were worn by my mother when she was a little girl, this kind of going back in time. What that makes me afraid of is then we're not progressing forward to accepting other peoples and other cultures, to accepting new ways of thinking about our God and creator and all. My fear is that there's a going backwards, to former ways of passing on the faith and ideas which are detrimental to a church that has to embrace cultures, other ways of thinking, other ways of living their faith. That's my fear, is that this polarization can result in going backwards instead of forwards. And I think the way forward is for all of us in the whole church, because our church was one of the biggest colonizers on the planet. The way we colonize people through our education and evangelization methods, that we go forward to learn. Decolonization is something and I see it with the Pope. I see him, the methods, I don't know if he doesn't call it, he does mention colonization in his talks, and decolonization is a method. And I see him enacting this and helping us to move forward. So that's what I think about so briefly. Anyways, thank you. And God bless everybody.
And finally, we call upon Alessandra Santopadra, who is one of our interviewees in the final chapter. Please, Alessandra.
Hi, for me, it was a great pleasure to be part in this interview, because giving me space where to reflect where faith and life meet, the title, and for me, where are concrete people on the move, specifically refugees, asylum seekers, migrants that I met every day. And meeting these people for me means transform my faith in concrete and tangible actions. And I use the Good Samaritan in Fratelli Tutti in my interview because it gave me the possibility to realize some action concrete, like stop, listening, touch, taking care, get his hands dirty. And for me, meeting these people, meeting their faith means transforming my life in culture of encounter, as Pope Francis say a lot. We have to create a culture of encounter, and for me, this culture of encounter means theology of encounter, where God is present in the life of these people, and I meet these people where they are, sometimes in the periphery, but also we reflect who is the periphery, where is the periphery. It depends who is who and what we put in the bottom. So for me, it was really, really a great experience. And my hope is that we can transform our attitude in concrete attitude and in theology of encounter with each people, every people that we meet.
Oh, thank you. Thank you to each and every one of our contributors. So hopefully this very brief overview has whet your appetite if you haven't already seen the book or engaged with the book. But whet your appetite to perhaps engage with the many learnings and insights that we have to offer. And I now will take this over, I believe, into the next part of this. All right. All right, we're now going to switch gears and we're going to now engage with our panel. So we are privileged to have two wonderful panelists who will further open up and build on the perspectives that are being shared. This is the second time that we have the privilege of collaborating with Dr. Cynthia Cameron, who holds the Keenan Chair of Religious Education at the University of St. Michael's College in Toronto. Her research and teaching delve deeply into important contextual perspectives impacting faith development and education. Father Raymond Lafontaine, who is our other panelist, has been involved in a number of ways in our research project over these past few years. He is the Episcopal Vicar and Director of English Pastoral Services for the Archdiocese of Montreal. He has participated in the Synod on Synodality in Rome as a table discussion facilitator and has been on a special research sabbatical to study synodality. Now, we know that paying attention to context is essential for effective adult faith education. So our panelists will each take up to 8 minutes to reflect on how a book like this is important for our current context and what they would like to see from its use in the field. And so once again, as Carol had mentioned, we invite you to pay attention to the points of resonance for your practice and what's on your mind these days, as well as to new perspectives that open up our learning and growing edges, and to pay attention to perhaps implications for our own practice and questions, perhaps insights that arise. And so we will begin, and I believe Father Raymond will begin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. It's good to be with you all today. I'm seeing lots of familiar faces out there, and that's always a comforting thing. In a recent interview that was published this month in Commonweal, the Czech theologian Thomas Haluk, who wrote a wonderful book recently called The Afternoon of Christianity, he makes these remarks about the contribution of Pope Francis to a renewed anthropology in our Catholic tradition. And it really relates very closely to some of the major issues in this book. Evangelization, he writes, is part of the ongoing mystery of the Incarnation. And the essence of evangelization is enculturation, a creative reinterpretation of the gospel message in the light of changing cultural and social contexts, those complex contexts that Father Ron was talking about before. Evangelization without enculturation is merely superficial indoctrination. The new evangelization was a nice slogan, but I'm afraid there was not a whole lot of new, real evangelization. The program of synodal renewal of the Church, announced by Pope Francis, is much deeper, where it offers a concrete, practical method of listening to one another and of discerning together. Pope Francis is building bridges. His call for the synodal renewal of the Church goes beyond the transformation of the Church from a more rigid, clerical or bureaucratic organization into a network of mutual communication that bears united witness for mission. Synodality is a shared journey. It is meant to renew, revive, and deepen communion, and not only within the Church. It is also about the Church's ability to communicate with other systems in society, with other cultures and religions, and the whole human family, and with the planet we inhabit, with the ongoing symphony of creation. It can also inspire the transformation of globalization into a true movement of sharing and solidarity. In reading and indeed rereading this profoundly insightful collection of essays, expertly edited and organized by Carol, Lorraine, and Miriam, I could not help but make the connection with some of my own experiences in accompanying adult faith over the last 30 years. One of my first extra parochial commitments I accepted after my ordination to the priesthood was to be on part of the advisory committee for our diocesan adult religious education services. And after I returned from my own doctoral studies in Rome in moral theology, I was involved in creating and accompanying a diocesan certificate program in adult faith formation with such great people, women of faith as Elizabeth Kessler and Sister Kay Duffin and Teresa Kerr, and some of them are actually here today. So I found that throughout my ministry, whether it was as a university chaplain and lecturer, as a parish priest, or more recently as an Episcopal vicar, I've seen the accompaniment of adult faith and the formation of those who are the lead learners on this journey, to use a wonderful expression from the resource, as a major pastoral priority. At the same time, we know that we're facing new challenges in presenting the gospel in a way that is fresh, attractive, and relevant to the experience of those who are seeking God's presence in their lives and in the world around them. And in response to this taps into some of the things that Daryl was just saying. There's been a trend, which is understandable, but I think regrettable, in many dioceses and parishes to de-emphasize or even eliminate approaches that foster the maturation of adult faith, going deeper, by investing only in those that answer what seems to be the more urgent or pressing need. Programs, Alpha being perhaps the best known and most widely used, whose outreach is primarily charismatic and fosters an initial personal faith commitment. But then you need beta and gamma and delta and epsilon. You want to keep going deeper. Even in parishes where Alpha and other similar outreach initiatives have been a godsend in reaching new people and giving them a grounding in the faith and an authentic desire to grow, either in their newfound or newly reclaimed faith, there's a struggle to assist both more recent converts and cradle Catholics in the maturation of their faith as a personal journey of inner transformation lived out in community and in the outer transformation of the world to which we are called in response to the promises of our baptism and confirmation, or our two first ordinations, as Father Ron referred to them. So building on the careful action research pursued over the past 6 years by Carol, Lorraine, and Miriam, by the various contributors to this book, and by the participants in the focus groups and the semi-structured interviews, which they have pursued with those involved in adult faith development across our country, we have here in this book, Where Faith and Life Meet, a timely resource. It is deeply relevant to the questions with which we as a church, which is called to be synodal, missionary, and merciful, to use those three adjectives Pope Francis loves so much, must grapple. What I appreciate about the book is also how deeply it is grounded in both solid empirical research and also concrete pastoral practice. As I made my way through the 12 chapters, I was impressed at once by the breadth and diversity of pastoral experiences visible in the various contributions, but also by how often their main preoccupations, anticipated and developed in the 3 resources already published online by the Center for Religious Education and Catechesis, how well they intersected and built on one another. This is not merely a connection of 12 disparate essays, but it really comes across as the result of a community of practice in which the accumulation of insights builds on one another and reaches to breakthroughs. And as a moral theologian, I appreciated how much that seminal quote from Gaudium et Spes on how the split between the faith we profess and our daily lives represents a serious error of our age is just as true in 2025 as it was 60 years ago. This research project as a whole and the contributions of each essay, I believe, converge in identifying paths that lead us to fulfill those 5 promising practices that were outlined in 2019, to provide effective frameworks and formation for adult faith development, to foster human and Christian growth in freedom, agency, and responsibility, to build authentic relationships in the context of ecclesial communion, to address the need for all God's people, not just priests and deacons, but everyone, in-depth, high-quality, human, intellectual, spiritual, and pastoral formation. and forming leaders who see themselves not as experts with all the answers, but lead learners who can accompany others in constructing meaning in the faith life journey. In my own experience as a table facilitator at the second session of the Synod, I witnessed many of the principles outlined in the text at work, in our common prayer, in our personal reflection on the task at hand, in our respectful interactions with one another, and in the model of conversation in the Spirit, which ensured that each participant had an equal voice in the dialogue and the decision-making process, because the same Holy Spirit was the guiding influence in which we all shared. And perhaps most outstandingly, in the way in which Pope Francis welcomed the final report from the Assembly as the work of the Holy Spirit and gave the seal of his apostolic authority. This was a blessing and affirmation of the work not only of the delegates and all those who assisted them, but of the literally millions of Catholics throughout the world who had participated since 2021 in the synodal journey, in parishes, lay and youth movements, intentional communities, online forums, all the different kinds of group which the researchers in this essay have worked with concretely, and which is beautifully done. And I think also of the outreach to those who are often on the margins of our church life. I really appreciated those last 3 chapters where Murray and Father Darrell and Alessandra and Father Susai spoke about their work accompanying particular groups that are often on the margins whose voices are not heard. What I received from the book as a whole is that adult faith formation, when it is well done and well pursued, can truly become the place where faith and life meet, where that gap between Christian faith and authentic human flourishing is bridged, so that we as individuals and we as church can bring this message of hope to the world in which we are sent to proclaim and live the transforming influence of the gospel. So may this resource continue to promote the culture of encounter to which Pope Francis has invited us in the synodal journey of the last 3 years. May it truly become a sign of Jubilee hope for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. We now invite Cynthia.
Thank you. And thank you so much for this invitation to not only read the book, but to join this community of people in talking about it. It's been a really rich experience. Last week, as I was reading Where Faith and Life Meet, I was traveling to Atlanta to participate in a workshop sponsored by the Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning in Theology and Religion. Our particular workshop group was gathered from theological schools across North America and was meeting to ponder, or at least begin the process of pondering together, what it means to invite those people who would not typically seek out a degree in theology or ministry into rich theological conversation. I have no answers to that question yet. But what struck me in this experience was the resonance between the kinds of adult faith formation that the authors and editors of this book propose and the ways that the Wabash facilitators gathered our community together. In particular, this meeting last week was intended to create community and to build relationships, and the Wabash staff did a fantastic job of this. We ate together. We walked outside together. We bowled together, which was exciting because it was the first time I'd bowled in like 30 years. We prayed together. We did a little bit of improv. We stressed out about the weather. I was in Atlanta and they had 3 inches of snow, but everybody freaked out and the airport shut down. So, but we had a chance to reflect on important questions. And after a relatively short time, we felt like we knew one another. We cared about one another, and we wanted to continue to engage with one another. And the Wabash staff have a knack for creating these kinds of engaging experiences that lead to the formation of real relationships. And I imagine that I am describing the kinds of relationship building things that you all engage in already in your adult community building. For me, this sense of faith formation as a deeply relational thing was the resounding chord that drove the melody of the reflections in this book. What all of the authors are suggesting in their chapters is dependent on the building of relationships among co-learners in faith contexts. Synodality, storytelling, generative dialogue, generative listening, reconciliation, caring for others. All of these things are fundamentally expressions of relationality. Our ability to engage in a transformative adult faith education is more dependent on our ability to create relationships among co-learners than it is the particular programs, events, or resources we formulate. And so I want to say three things about relationality that kept bouncing around in my head as I was reading this book. And I want to talk about robust relationships, a culture of encounter, and slow pedagogy. So first, robust relationships. This is an idea I borrow from Teresa O'Keeffe's book, Navigating Towards Adulthood, although there are echoes here in Jane's note about adults being in conversation with other adults about things that matter. But in her book, O'Keeffe proposes that ministry with adolescents must be grounded on the building of robust relationships between adolescents and caring non-parental adults. In these robust relationships, the adolescent feels seen and known as a unique individual by an adult who narrates for the adolescent the ways that faith and life come together. I would suggest that adults, and not just adolescents, need these kinds of relationships in their lives. To have people in our lives who see and know us. To have people in our lives who we see and know. To have people in our lives who narrate to us what they believe, why they believe it, and how it plays out in their lives. To have people in our lives to whom we can say what we believe, why we believe it, and how it prompts our daily decisions. In our increasingly secular world, in which being a person of faith is not always the easiest thing, robust relationships provide contexts in which we can figure out what it means to be a faithful person. Second, in Pope Francis's insistence that Christians are called to the creation of a culture of encounter, we find an invitation to expand our notions of relationship. We are called to foster a culture that sees Christ in the other, receives Christ through the other, and tries to be Christ for the other. In Evangelii Gaudium, which was written at the very beginning of his pontificate, Pope Francis reminds us that the gospel calls us to, quote, run the risk of a face-and-face encounter with others, with their physical presence, which challenges us, with their pain and their pleas, with their joy that infects us in our close and continuous interaction. True faith in the incarnate Son of God is inseparable from self-giving, from membership in the community, from service, from reconciliation with others. The Son of God, by becoming flesh, summoned us to a revolution of tenderness, end quote. Particularly in the later chapters of this book, the authors are repeating this summons to see one another, to love and care for one another, and to shape a revolution of tenderness. I love that phrase. The authors are calling us to a culture of encounter, rooted in the seeking out of relationships with companions along the way. And third is slow pedagogy. This is not a teaching technique. Rather, slow pedagogy is an approach to teaching and learning experiences that allow learning to take the time that it takes. Slow pedagogical approaches allow for silence, for deep listening, for sitting with ideas, for engaging new learnings, for approaching ideas from multiple perspectives, for hearing everyone's experiences and knowledges. Slow pedagogy honors the importance of the learners, the importance of the content of the learning, and the importance of the learning process itself. Adult faith formation, to meet people where they are to be transformative, and to be experiences of relationality is and must be a slow process. And as lead learners, we have a responsibility to our co-learners to allow the learning to proceed slowly. I conclude with a word or two about why I, as someone who is primarily interested in adolescence and adolescent faith formation, find this book to be particularly important. At its most basic level, we spend most of our lives as adults and not as children and adolescents. And so, the apportionment of years, God willing, as adults should drive our attention to adult faith formation. But in our contemporary church context, we seem to have gotten into a habit of focusing on the faith formation of children and adolescents. The adults in our faith communities receive little to no formal faith formation after confirmation or graduation from a Catholic high school. Even high quality faith formation in childhood and adolescence, as we are reminded in this book, might not adequately equip adults for the task of faithing in and throughout adulthood in an increasingly complex world. So while I am, of course, interested in the faith formation of the adults who work with young people, I am more broadly interested in what adult faithing can look like and towards which we can guide our young people. Robust adult faith formation means that we are not sending our young people into adulthood under-equipped for faithing, that our faith communities are prepared to continue to build on the foundations laid in childhood and adolescence, and invite adults into increasingly sophisticated ways of making meaning in their world, informed by thoughtful adult faith education. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to both our panelists. So we've listened now to many perspectives as we have unpacked our book with you today. We'd now like to open a space for you to engage in some good conversations with others. So in a moment, you will find yourself in a breakout room with a small group. And we invite you to discuss your reflections on all you've heard from our commentators, our contributing authors, as well as from our panelists. So here are the questions, and they're very similar to what we've been invited you to think about throughout. Do we have a PowerPoint to go up for this? I believe so. All right, these are the questions. What are the points of resonance? So what has resonated with you? And again, what are the new perspectives or learning edges? And how then might this impact? What implications might this have then for your practice? In other words, what difference might this make for you? And then, of course, are there any questions or concerns, anything that comes up to you that you would like to discuss in your small group? So you'll have about 20 minutes for your conversations. Then we're going to gather back here in the large group to hear some echoes and to engage some of the responses. And so commentators or our panelists to also say a few words. So let's make this as interactive as possible when there are so many of us online. All right? We'll do our best for that. So I think it might be a good idea. How about if you put your hand up? Is it possible to put your hand up with one of those reactions? Let me just check to see. Do you all know where to find that? Oh, Murray found it and Daryl found it. So here we are. So we probably should be okay. If you're not able to find it and you really want to speak, I would just say speak up and we'll listen because your box will around you will turn yellow. Let's go to Murray, and I'm going to go right across the screen on top. So I've got Murray, Daryl, Luke, and then Christine. Murray, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Lorraine. One of the things that surfaced in our conversation that I hadn't even thought about is how wonderfully well retreat centers in Canada have been doing this work for decades and decades, many of them sponsored by religious communities, supported by religious communities, but they have been places that have allowed for some of the kinds of conversations that we've been talking about, and how sad we were to realize that, over the last few years, a lot of them have shut down, a lot of them are shutting down.
Yeah.
I think they are really privileged places and real models of what these kinds of generative conversations can look like. And I think we need more of them rather than less, but unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the trend right now.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Marie. Something to lament, right? The loss of those generative spaces. Luke, go ahead, please.
Well, thanks. Well, we was just really struck by this expression lead learner that came up several times, and the importance of an approach of lead learner. And within our own organization at Development and Peace, we do try and, we've been very influenced by notions of popular education and movements of popular education, that notion of a lead learner, it resonates with greatly. And in my own experience as an aspiring lead learner and the various roles I've played in Development and Peace, one of the challenges I find as well too is inviting people or inspiring people to take the responsibility for their faith formation and for their learning, because that can be in some ways easier to just say, here I am, dump the information into me, whereas a mature faith formation requires really an active engagement and commitment and risk, and is challenging. So I think that's also part of being a lead learner, and one of the challenges of being a lead learner, that approach is really challenging people to take their faith formation seriously. And how do we inspire people? How do we awaken in them the desire to do that, instead of just being passive recipients? So anyways, that's one reflection I want to share.
Yeah, and that's such a rich one. I mean, it's really about calling us an adult faith or an adult church as a co-responsible church, right? One in which we all take responsibility for our faith and our faith formation. So thank you for sharing that, Luke. Christine.
So in our group, we also focused on the importance of the lead learner, accompaniment and relationship, and a few other things that arose different from what Luke had said was that the importance of a slow pedagogy, we love that word, allowing the time, as lead learners, not being afraid to listen, like the importance of just learning that piece of it, and not being afraid of the silence.
Why don't we call back Cynthia about that? Because Cynthia is the one that raised that for us, didn't she? The on the slow pedagogy. Do you have something to add to that, Cynthia?
The only thing that I would add to it's a movement that's coming out of higher education, but I think is really important in education in all levels and in all contexts. I first encountered slow pedagogy actually through some research that I was doing into Indigenous pedagogies. And so there's a great deal of resonance, I think, between slow pedagogy and some of the listening methods and models that Daryl was talking about. That those processes of deep listening and allowing new knowledge and new experiences to just sit with you without immediately reacting to them. And I think that there's a lot of real possibilities in faith environments for kind of creating these kinds of communities that deeply listen to each other rather than reacting to what they hear.
All right, thank you. Which is really at the heart, right? We use quite a bit the language of generative conversation, right? That really is at the heart of what that slow pedagogy would look like. Yeah, thank you for that. I don't see any hands up in the corner. So what has struck you? What is it? What are the insights that you bring from your small group discussion that you'd like to bring now to the plenary? Yes, go ahead, Christine.
Just another question that was also brought up in our small group was just the danger of synodality replacing evangelization. I would like to have heard a little bit more about that, realizing that both synodality and evangelization are important. But what's that thing that's happening, that danger that's happening?
Right. So do we call upon Jane for this? All right. One of the cautions, Jane. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I'm not sure, and I feel like I don't want to say too much about synodality without where's our synodality? Oh, without Father Ray's comments. So, but let me just jump in with this. So this is really someone coming really from a perspective of emphasizing evangelization. So my little feelings are hurt because it feels like evangelization is replacing or that synodality is replacing evangelization. I'm thinking, and I'm willing to be corrected, and we'll hope to be corrected if needed, that I understand synodality is about the internal life of the church, and that evangelization it's internal, but it's also primarily external to the life of the church. In other words, it's the outreach of the church, and that and I think in that sense that if we are a synodal church, we're also an evangelizing church. Now, for an evangelist, just not necessarily a synodal church, I don't think, but we could be. And so I don't see them as in conflict, but rather as two angles on the one on what it means to be church. So we want to be both a synodal church and an evangelizing church. Ray, what do you think?
I like that. Let's go to Ray and then we'll go to you, Anne. Is that okay?
Yeah, I think it's really important to note that at the second session of the synod, the guiding question was not what is a synodal church, but how to be a synodal church in mission. Like it was made very clear that synodality is not an end in itself. It's not like it's not just a technique and it's not just an organizational principle. It's according to the definition in the final document, it is a constitutive dimension of the church, a path of spiritual renewal and structural reform that enables the church to be more participatory and missionary and to radiate the light of Christ to the world with all people. So for me, it's I think we often tend to we like compartments and boxes, and we like to put adult faith formation in one box, evangelization in one box, and synodality in another box, and they all have to meet somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
I think I think where you place the emphasis maybe is perhaps the key, but I really believe that and it's very interesting to see in Pope Francis, his programmatic encyclical being Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel, the joy of proclaiming the gospel. But we do that most effectively when we are living it in our internal structures and in our personal spiritual lives. So I think that's where they come together. And that's one of the points that I raised of a concern with evangelization models that are so charismatic that they don't necessarily take seriously what the maturation of faith and the growth of faith that needs to follow the initial response. Thank you.
Thank you. Good points.
Thank you. Thank you. Shall we go to Anne?
Sure, and it's a very similar part of the similar conversation in our group. Mm-hmm. We had talked about Jane's idea that we tend to be sequential. It's like flavor of the month, or worse. We think that adult faith formation approaches are kind of a box lunch rather than a buffet, and so that there are all these different options available to us, but we tend to be boxed into one way of looking at things, one approach. And in terms of adult faith formation and helping, assisting people, walking with people that faith and life might meet or meet more effectively, we need a multitude of perspectives and approaches, programs, yes, but approaches and ways available to us. It's as if we were kind of lamenting the fact that the rite of Christian initiation of adults has kind of dropped off the scene in favor of the new evangelization and then in favor of synodality, when they're not in opposition to each other. There's a place for all of it, and skilled catechists and synodal communities will have a good sense of how to access and use and draw on all of these approaches to be the most effective as possible. So yeah, that was our conversation. Yeah.
All right. That adds a whole different perspective. Thank you for that, Anne. Go ahead, Christine. Christine, you're on mute.
I always do that. Just to the point of things being sort of in competition and flavor of the day, and that, like, one of my favorite lines from the really, really early document on synodality, I think it was the 50th anniversary of the synod, is when the Pope says that, our gaze is out to humanity, and a synodal church is like a standard lifted up. Like, a synodal church is a church with some credibility because we've attempted to listen to the Spirit in everyone. So we can evangelize better because we actually listen to the voice of the Spirit in everyone. So our wisdom is greater, but also the way we treat one another is greater. We treat one another like we're all the presence of Christ to one another. And so I actually see that this is our way of being evangelical, our way of being in mission, and we're credible, right? Because we have a credibility problem right now in the way that we, dominate people and have dominated in all entire cultures in our history. And this is a very, very different model. And just to, Anne's point about, people saying, oh, RCI is gone and turns the new, and replaced with the new evangelization. And we do that actually, but this is one of the reasons why in my chapter, I actually said, this is how this will look in RCIA. This is how this will look in First Communion Prep. This is how because it actually transforms everything. It is incorporated into everything, both evangelization and synodality.
Right.
You don't replace things. So yeah, I just thought to say that. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Christine. Carol, you had your hand up.
Thanks, Lorraine. I just popped in a comment that does the trick, so no need to stop with me.
All right. Shall I read that comment? Because I think it does, it brings that aspect. And my sense is that we also need to be cautious about not simply collapsing adult catechesis into evangelization, as if adult faith education doesn't have a specific educating formation role. So this again is a bit of a caution, right? Not to collapse one into the other. Thank you, Carol. Jane, go ahead.
Just one more comment, not the last one, certainly. But I do think that's where communities of practice come in as being an essential tool or approach that can bring some of these into dialogue with one another. Certainly, a community of practice has in its essence a synodal approach to understanding the group relationship and the relationship among groups. And I think that it has a richness that's worth looking into further. So I would encourage that.
Thank you. And you've raised such an important aspect, which this research has been so much, right? A community of practice over time in which these insights have come out. Carol, I see your hand up.
Yeah, so I just want to add to what Jane has offered us so graciously. And it goes back to what Father Ron was mentioning about, what's really a lack of good, rigorous opportunities for adults to have those learning, growing spaces in faith. And I say that by way of, underscoring again the point that we have to attend to our education and formation as such, certainly within the context of being an evangelizing synodal church in whatever way we want to grapple with those relationships. But, the education and formation of people with the intentionality of leading towards mature discipleship and human flourishing is just essential, and we're not good at it.
Well, thank you, Carol. Let's we have one more hand up with Christine, and then what we'll do is we're going to call upon our panelists and our commentators for their final word. Christine.
I just want to quote Ron Rolheiser, and maybe this will give him a lead into what he's going to say. But a long time ago, this is one of the quotes that I live by and say to my people all the time, like, we have all the programs. Like, if someone walks through the church door, we can meet their needs. But Ron said they're no longer walking through our church doors. And I think this whole conversation about accompaniment and co-responsibility, like what we're presenting here, addresses what Ron wrote about many years ago. We're finally getting to that place.
Wow. That's a wonderful segue into, Ron, can we open up the space for your final word for us?
Okay, well, final word. I'm going to quote our founder, the Oblates of Mary Immaculate. When he had very few resources, he always said, and that's our school motto, leave nothing undared. Okay, I'll leave it at that. You know, we can't go out there and be safe and do the things over and over again. We got to leave no. And as Christina said, we pretty well know what to do when somebody walks to a church door. Our big problem is they're not walking through our church doors.
Oh, well, there's a wonderful challenge. Leave nothing undared. Thank you for that. Jane, your final word.
Yeah, I have nothing quite that that clear and tight. I guess I would pick up and highlight the comment made earlier about the role of retreat centers. That I found myself as an adult in the church being left out of most adult offerings because they're very basic, and they're often poorly done. Not everybody, but they're often poorly done. And as a teacher myself, I just go a little nuts in that kind of context. And so recognizing how we can support our retreat centers, and whether we support them financially or with doing workshops or whatever, to continue to keep that resource helpful. Because I know just in the retreat centers around here that many people there are people who don't go to, who aren't participating in local parish. This is where their faith is from. This is where their faith community is in retreat centers. And so providing a way to think about that is just another thing to think about, another encouragement.
Cynthia, your final word.
Sure, thank you. I think the final word that I want to leave all of us with is an encouragement to continue engaging in this ongoing work, because in some ways this book is a culmination of your project, but in so many more ways it's a call to action for the continuation of this work. I think that this work needs to be ongoing because adults need this, and kids need this. Kids need the adults in their lives to have this. And the church needs believers who are formed for the life of each person and for the life of the world. And I just, I really encourage adult faith formation people, all of us, to not lose faith and to continue the work.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Raymond.
I think I'd like to leave us with an image. I think one of my favorite images from the synod was a picture that was taken on the final day, just after we'd approved the final document. And you see the Pope at the center of that huge Paul VI synod hall, surrounded by everybody who was there. And what was interesting about it, the Pope is at the center. You would know him because he's the one in white. But everybody else is in a big circle all around. And it's not, and there's bishops and there's cardinals and there's lay people and sisters and there's the delegates and the people who were working behind the scenes and the facilitators and the translators and the people who were making the coffee. But we were all together in the picture. No one group closer to the Pope than the other, all bearing witness together. And one thing I've heard from several of the bishops who participated in the synod saying, we can't imagine going back to the way it was before, where we all sat facing the front of the room and one person spoke at a time and we all fell asleep. This whole interactive model of learning, listening, discerning, and deciding, and learning, and in an ongoing process. I'm really hoping that somehow we are able to capture that energy and continue to move forward, because I think that's the kind of church that we need. And I think this resource gives us some really good tools to how to build that kind of church.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Raymond. Carol, I leave the space for you to bring us to conclusion.
Yes, thank you. It's my privilege to open the space and now to invite us to conclude our time together. I just want to apologize. We're a couple of minutes over. We do have a closing prayer, a brief one, that we'd like to do. We also have a promotional code for all of you from Novalis Publishing. Anyone who would like to get the book for 20% off, here's the code. Gabrielle's just showing that to you, and we'll send it out to all of you who have registered for this session so that you'll have it in your email box as well. It's only active until January 31st. So if you want that discount, you have to do it pretty soon. I want to extend a huge thank you to our commentators, Father Ronald Rollheiser, Dr. Jane Regan, and to our two panelists, Father Raymond LaFontaine and Dr. Cynthia Cameron, for their excellent input and framing and questioning and lifting up perspectives that I certainly have found so helpful. Have you as well, all of you who are here participating with us? Yeah, I know we don't really have we can't really make a lot of noise, but we can do this and clap and say thank you. You've really enriched this book launch and webinar, and we thank you so much. The same to our contributing editors. My goodness, it has been a privilege to partner. Sorry, our contributing authors. It has been such a privilege to partner in this project with all of you. Thank you, thank you. And thank you to all of you for coming today and making this such a meaningful book launch. I don't know about you, but I've been so enriched by all that we've shared here over this short but very meaningful time together. So thanks to all of you. Here's a good example of an experience of a community of practice that can really support and expand and enrich the important work that we do. So thank you. We are starting a certificate in adult faith education in April. If you'd like to know more about that, please contact me. We're just starting with a small cohort for this first round. If you're interested, if that piques your interest, get in touch with me and I'd be happy to provide you with more information. We're really excited to be starting this project, this program. Also, in September, we're going to be beginning what we're calling conversation community of practice series, where we'll gather in this way on a regular basis to lift up current concerns, questions, resources together and have webinars, interactive webinars that can help us all to continue our own formation by engaging as a community practice. So stay in touch. We'll tell you more about that as time goes on. We're on LinkedIn and we're on Facebook. So if you do want to connect with us in those locations, please feel free to do so. I'm so pleased to end with inviting Sister Mary Ellen Franco, our wonderful collaborator and liaison, who will lead us in a closing prayer.
Thank you, Carol, and thanks to all who have been here today. As Anne had in her opening prayer made it interactive, the Spirit led me the same way. I felt there was a need for us all to be able to be engaged in this closing prayer. So as you can see on your screen, I will make a statement or in the prayer, and what's written in dark, you respond. So there are two parts to the prayer. One is giving thanks, and the second is a blessing. Transforming Spirit, for the sacred journey of bringing this book into being,
we give deep thanks.
For the dedication and enthusiasm of all who were involved in its creation,
we give deep thanks.
For the many years of experience and love of the adult faith educators,
we give deep thanks.
For the openness of those they accompanied,
we give deep thanks.
For the new awareness, insight, and transformation experienced,
we give deep thanks.
Okay. And so then we're going to ask for a blessing on the new life of this precious resource.
Oh.
So I'm holding it up so it's visible to all of you, and I invite everyone present to extend their hands in blessing. That this precious resource will move out to all who need its wisdom and inspiration.
May it be
blessed. That its use will nurture communities of those yearning for a growing, sustaining, responsive faith.
May it be blessed.
That it will inspire a reaching out to groups so often marginalized.
May it be
blessed. That it will invite further exploration and research.
May it be blessed.
And we offer this prayer in the energy of your ongoing creativity, transforming spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Thank
you, Mary Ellen, for that beautiful conclusion. And thank you, everyone, for being here. It's been a rich and expanding time, and we're so grateful that you've come to be with us to open the way for this, what we hope will be a supportive resource in our practice going forward. Hope to see you all again soon. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.